Absolutely. Everyone does have a flaw. Let's start with Brock Purdy's flaws. The Browns exposed him to a degree. Maybe it was one bad game. Maybe it was Jim Schwartz showing the rest of the league the blueprint to, I don't know, shut down Brock Purdy or to best defend Brock Purdy. So how do you see it? Was it him getting exposed or was it just a bad game?
I think he's struggling with a wet football. To me, he looked at times really good in this game. First drive, last drive. But in that late second quarter, Grant, when the rain came, he looked bad. Now, when I say bad, I mean the ball, to me, the word people will point to the Emerson pick that he threw in the second half. But I thought the worst two balls were the one that slipped out of his hand, of course, and then the ball that he threw to Kittle. Kittle was totally open. He wanted to throw it over his right shoulder, and it just slipped out of his hand and fluttered and floated and landed like out of bounds over his left shoulder. So maybe Brock struggles. You know, you would think an Iowa State guy who's played in the Big 12 has probably played in some weather, but maybe the weather is a big part of it. That and, you know, this was the number one defense on the road without all your weapons. I mean, I don't want to throw that as excuses. To me, it seems like when the conditions were dry, he was a far better player than when the ball got wet.
Hard to tell how wet the ball was without being out there. I thought it might have been more than the weather. It seemed like what he was facing was something he didn't normally face. A really good four-man pass rush and really good man-to-man coverage across the board, 3 good corners. And it's like most of the time he can get the ball out so quickly against zone. He's so smart. I feel like he almost knows what the coverage is before the play starts. He can diagnose it. Kyle helps him with the motion and the shifts. But if it's man, you can't necessarily decide or know where to go with the ball before the snap. You just can't, like you can against zone. You have to pick a matchup you like and sort of guess or go through your progressions and really read the field. And I think him trying to do that against that pass rush behind that offensive line made him look like the least confident I've ever seen him. It wasn't just that his passes were off. He looked like not that strutting, calm, confident Brock Purdy we're used to seeing. He looked like Tua against the Niners last year. He looked a little sped up and uncomfortable, which is interesting. So I don't know if another team, maybe it's just the Browns are that good. I mean, maybe the blueprint is have the best defense.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a secret to it. It's just like if you can put some serious rush on the quarterback and then you can have great coverage on the back end. I'll tell you
the special sauce.
I'll tell you one guy that I thought kind of was the special sauce. JOK, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. If you have that kind of a player in the second level, I think that's, you want to say, how do you beat Brock Purdy? Have that kind of second level player. It's harder to throw it over Koramoah. It's harder to get away from Koramoah. It's hard. I mean, he's fast and instinctive and smart. He gets deep on his drops. He tightens those windows. When he blitzes, he's coming and it's unbelievable. And you can't get away from him. You can't sidestep him. So I thought Koramoah made an impact in this game, especially when I watched it over again. But then I'll say this too: the Niner receivers very, very poor in this game. There was no Debo. Kittle was even out there, didn't see him. Ray is a nice gadget player, return man. He's not a starting caliber wide receiver. Jennings was the only guy who really played. And Ayuk picked a bad time to have the worst game of the year. I mean, Ayuk was awful, man. I mean, Ayuk made some catches, but he dropped 3 balls. If he catches those 3 balls, I mean, once CMC was down, once Debo was out, it was a Brandon Ayuk game. And they targeted him 10 times and he caught 4 balls. And 3 of them ricocheted off his hands. You're a receiver. When the ball hits you in the hands, you got to catch it. That's why they call you a receiver. So, I don't know if there was a secret sauce against Purdy other than JOK. But Ayuk has got to be way better, especially if he's the only weapon. And maybe the Niners need a little bit more dynamic weapon. You know, they need the speed of Gray, or they need somebody who can provide that speed because they look kind of slow, to be honest.
Ayuk needs to be better. Purdy needs to be better as well. He missed Christian McCaffrey on a deep pass that should have been a touchdown. It was wide open. He needs to feel what it's like to throw into tight windows more. I feel like against zone with Kyle and these weapons, he often has some wide open guys. And then finally, I feel like this is on Kyle too. He kept calling these in-breaking routes that were having a tough time throwing over that linebacker, as you said. What about the outbreaking routes? I feel like Brock Purdy does a nice job throwing the outbreaking routes, particularly to his left. I would have liked to see more of that. And also, where the hell is George Kittle? Kyle, would you please call George Kittle's number? It's not fair when McCaffrey and Debo are already out and you're like freezing out George Kittle. Or what do you guys, did you have a fight? Are you not talking? That's weird. You got to call George Kittle's number when other people are hurt or whenever. You're paying him $15 million a year. Come on.
George Kittle can't just be a blocker.
No.
George Kittle's got to be a receiver. They're underutilizing George Kittle. George Kittle was only targeted twice in this game. Over the last 3 weeks, he's been targeted 7 times. He's only been targeted 25 times all year. Cole Kmet, Tyler Conklin, Jake Ferguson. These tight ends have been targeted more than George. So start using
Kyle.
George a little bit. And as far as criticism on Kyle, you know, what were you going up against? You were going up against the number 1 defense, but they were the number 1 pass defense in the league. I think they were 7th against the run. Run the freaking ball. You had 27 pass attempts and 25 runs. You had a greater run pass run split. You should have had a 60-40 run pass split, especially once Debo went out early. They should have ran the ball. They should have ran Mason more. How do you give Mason only 5 carries? And it's pretty clear that Kyle hasn't learned on this one, Grant. Not only he's still, when he was asked this week about Mason, he's like, yeah, do you have confidence in Mason? And he started doing a little salute about Mitchell. So
no.
About Mason, I don't know if it's a fact that we saw him fumble a few times in camp, or if he doesn't pick up blocks and Bobby T's upset. But for whatever reason, in my mind, it goes CMC, Mason, Mitchell. And in their mind, it goes CMC, Mitchell, Mason.
Okay, so wrapping this topic up, neither of us feel like Brock Purdy was exposed. We do feel like the Browns showed a good strategy against him. And there's one thing we saw in the second half that I'm curious to see this week. Purdy without Christian McCaffrey. A big reason Purdy sees so much zone is because a lot of teams feel they can't match up with McCaffrey man-to-man because they can't. But if he's out, we've never really seen Purdy play without McCaffrey. I'd like to know. I mean, in the second half, it wasn't good, although he did leave that drive at the end. So if there's another game of it, that's maybe not where he's exposed, but where like we learn more. Because right now it's hard to learn when you're on the best team. I feel like we're learning that with Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts has been on the best team for a while. And now he's coming back to earth in a major way. It was his 4th year in the league. We're still learning about Jalen Hurts, and he's like 60 starts under his belt. So that's just what we're going to see Purdy without Christian McCaffrey eventually. We saw it a little bit. I'd like to see a little more just to know, just to learn.
You know, this was also, I think it has to be noted too, that, you know, people have argued that CMC is redundant with Debo, and I can see the argument. It makes sense. But this game, they had neither. I mean, you know, they had McCaffrey in the first drive and he scored a touchdown. Then they didn't have McCaffrey and they didn't have Debo. You got to have one of those guys, right? If you're going to have a quarterback that doesn't really drive the ball down the field, you got to have that super gadget runner / receiver. And it's okay if you don't have CMC if you got Debo. It's okay if you don't have Debo if you got McCaffrey. But if you don't have both, then I think that puts a lot more pressure on Brock.
Well, Kyle's a genius, so I think he should be able to figure it out. You have George Kittle, man. It's called finding George Kittle on the field. You can do it, Kyle. I know you have at least 50 plays that feature George Kittle in your playbook. Call 7.